I thought I'd read this to you. It says, please read this. I wrote it about 50 years ago, a while after I got back from Vietnam. So I'd just like to read it to you with your permission. It starts off, it says, for over a week I have been searching for a way to express the facts and the feelings I have about Vietnam. It's been very hard because I want to write something so that when people who haven't been to Vietnam read it, they will have a better understanding of what Vietnam is like. And then I think of the demonstrations and the talks over the radio and the TV and the articles written in newspapers and magazines, and I think of the politicians and other influential men and women who want to stop the war. And I wonder if writing this is going to make any difference at all. So instead of taking on the world, I'm going to start with my portion of it. I'm going to try to explain to one person who still believes in the war, one person who's not sure, or one person who doesn't believe in the war, but hasn't put that belief into action. I hope I can do that. I hope that will help in some way. Please listen. It never entered my mind not to go into the military. I never thought of defecting or draft dodging, or going to prison, or trying to look for some other way out. I have been brought up to be obedient and honest and to assume responsibility. One responsibility of a healthy American male is to defend his country. And I believe that. And I believed that the military built men. To run from the military service was to be considered less than a man. And I believed that if one Asian country fell to the communists, then the rest would fall. And I believed if I had to go to Vietnam to preserve freedom, then anything less than that would be cowardly. In 1965, I was 20. I wasn't going to college anymore. Getting a job for the future wasn't a very good idea because I could be drafted at any time. I didn't want to get a temporary job because it wouldn't get much out of it. I wouldn't get much out of it, and the draft would still be over my head. So I decided to enlist and get my military service out of the way. I went to see the Navy recruiter and the Air Force recruiter. I also went to see the Army recruiter. He was sitting in a little white recruiting shack near the Hunts Point subway station in the Bronx. I sat down surrounded by Army pictures and Army books and military insignia. The sergeant was very friendly, understanding, compassionate, and a good listener. Many of the sergeants I met after enlisting did not come from the same home. We discussed some of the Army schools that were available and some of the possible trades I could learn. While I was talking, I was imagining myself as a combat engineer, building bridges with one hand and fighting off the enemy with the other. Hard to believe I was thinking that, or thinking that now that I'm 75. Seems hard to believe at that time. I'd seen a lot of war movies when I was a kid. I was interested in helicopter school, and the sergeant set up an appointment so I could take a qualification test. I took the test and passed. A couple of weeks later, I signed my name to a piece of paper along with 3 years of my life. I caught the subway in the Bronx one early morning when it was still dark outside, and I got off at Whitehall Street at the lower end of Manhattan, and I was inducted. I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey for 11 months. I learned about right faces and left faces and guard duty and KP and marching and getting up at 3 a.m. and first aid and radios and gas attacks and rifles and machine guns and pistols and bayonet fighting and barracks and beer halls and shining brass and spit shining boots and PXs and Jeeps and 2.5-ton trucks and getting paid once a month and corporals and sergeants and lieutenants and captains and majors and colonels and generals. I learned rules and regulations and discipline. I learned how much endurance my body was capable of. I learned about myself and I learned about other people. After 11 months, I found out I wasn't going to helicopter school. I was given a 30-day leave and orders to Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. If any of you have seen From Here to Eternity, those are the barracks. So there I was at Schofield Barracks with 2 years left. I never knew how long I was going to be in Hawaii. When I got my orders at Fort Dix, I had visions of getting off one plane, getting kissed by an Hawaiian girl, and loaded on to another plane bound for Vietnam. It was a standing rumor from the time I got off the plane until we left in ships about 15 months later. Hey, did you hear the new rumor? What? We're going to know. Guys were still saying that in the middle of the Pacific Ocean going over. When I got to Schofield, a new brigade was starting to form. An infantry brigade is comprised of 3 or 4 battalions, and a battalion is comprised of 5 companies, and the company is supposed to have about 160 men. When I got there, my company had about 20 or 30 men. The 25th Division had left en masse for Vietnam and closed down the barracks, locked up the doors, and the Army was starting from scratch to build up another brigade. Things were pretty confused. New people were always showing up. New officers and sergeants were coming to the company, not knowing what was going on, but were unfortunately put in a position to tell the men under them what to do, while they were still trying to figure out what to do. Most of the first few months we just did things to keep occupied until things got straightened out. It takes a lot of organization to feed and clothe and train a brigade of men. I was there over a year and always wondered if they ever accomplished that feat totally. I had KP, that's kitchen police, about every 3 or 4 days, or we marched, or cleaned the barracks, or cleaned our rifles, or shined our boots. Meanwhile, the company kept growing. Occasionally, sergeants or lieutenants would be changed. The company commander was changed once. The rank of a company commander is a captain, and he is the man who is in charge of the company. When the skipper of a ship is changed, everybody on that ship is going to feel the difference. The company was always in the midst of different rules and regulations and priorities. The battalion commander was replaced and the brigade commander was replaced, and each time a new man took over, he had his own ideas about how a brigade or a battalion or company should be run. We found out almost immediately what new rules and regulations the new commander had on his mind and what he was going to enforce. All we could do was shrug it off and climb aboard the next ship. The barracks are a very important part of our Army life. A place to rest and sleep and take a shower, and a place to keep your clothes and uniforms. Home. The barracks at Schofield were different from others I had lived in. They had 3 floors. The street level had the mess hall and the supply room, and the arms room and the orderly room. The 2nd and 3rd floors were the living quarters. You'd walk up the stairs, and when you got off the first landing or the 2nd, you'd be standing on a long, wide porch or balcony, or as they say in Hawaii, a lanai. It had a metal railing along the edge to save the lives of clumsy infantrymen. Along the length of the lanai were about 4 or 5 sets of screen doors, which all went into one large bay. On the opposite side of the bay were sets of windows which looked out onto the street. They gave us a view of the barber shop, PX Annex, hobby center, traffic light, and the girls walking to and from the PX. The other 2 walls of the bay were blank concrete, which was the main material used in all the buildings. There were 4 large posts in the proper position in the bay to help hold the building up. One of the beautiful things about the bay were the floors. Some barracks have the floors which take hours and hours and hours to sweep and mop and wax and buff before inspection, and swept and mopped and buffed every morning before training. The floors at Schofield were smooth stone or granite or something which only needed sweeping and mopping. I was overjoyed when I first saw them. If you've ever walked from one bed to another to avoid touching a buffed tile floor and spent hours buffing in small little circles with a rebellious buffing machine, it would be easier to understand. The lighting system was light bulbs covered with those old fixtures that looked like big white mushrooms hanging upside down. They gave out enough light and gave the bay a kind of mellow parlor feeling at night instead of blaring fluorescent business office feeling. Now add to this quiet, empty bay about 40 men and 40 beds and 40 foot lockers and 80 wall lockers. Actually, I am remembering when it was less crowded. It was easier to remember because it was easier to move around. There were about 40 men in a platoon and 4 platoons in a company. There were times when we had 2 platoons in one bay, which came close to 80 bodies. The change is made with double-decker bunks and moving the wall lockers closer together. The added amount of men in the bay made it a little more noisy and longer lines for showers, but it's not that bad. Once your privacy is lost to 39 men, another 40 really doesn't make a difference. The bunks were metal beds with soft springs, and mattresses were thin enough to fold into the shape of an S without trying to spring back. Everyone had 2 wall lockers, one for his military gear and one for his civilian clothes and odds and ends. Wall lockers were portable metal closets that could hold a tall, thin mummy. We also had a footlocker for toiletry items and socks. Footlockers are green wooden boxes whose length is the width of a bunk, and if you stumbled into one at night, would cause severe pain a few inches below your knee. A major part of the Army, especially in the infantry, was inspections. Normally we had inspections on Saturday morning, which meant we were supposed to work all through Friday night to get ready. It's busier than other nights in the bay, but still quiet. Some guys would be lying on their bunks, hands clasped behind their head, watching the ceiling. Some would be shining brass, the brass insignia that goes on the collars of uniforms. Elsewhere in the bay you'd find someone who put one footlocker on top of another, put a blanket over that, and use that as an ironing board. He'd be standing there, hot iron in hand, wearing underwear and sandals, getting his uniform ready. Some guys would be spit-shining their boots. To have a good spit-shine pair of boots meant when you were finished, you could see your reflection in them. It means taking a small rag or piece of cotton, some black shoe polish, and either water or saliva, and apply the polish and water in the right proportions, working in small circular motion until your fingers hurt, your eyes hurt, your back hurts, and your mind hurts because you find it hard to believe you're doing this. T-shirts and underpants and socks have to be folded in a certain way. All military uniforms have to be in a certain order in the wall locker. All equipment from a fork and a mess kit to a rifle have to be spotless. Some guys who were already finished would be writing letters or singing in the shower, or talking about the inspection or details, or cars, or girlfriends, or helping someone who wasn't finished. That was one beautiful thing about the Army. We had about every kind of people: Mexican, black, Chinese, Puerto Rican, white, Indian, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, atheist. It was a beautiful chance for people to meet different kinds of people without having to hate or fear them, having a chance to work with them and talk to them and understand them. We were either going to work together or fall apart and pay the consequences together. There is a lot to be learned about the people you live with, close to 24 hours a day. You learn how to lend your time or your shoe polish or your shaving cream. You learn how to borrow soap or an iron or a shine belt buckle, and you learn how to give help and how to receive it. Hey Miller, can I have the iron after you? I have to do one shirt. Roberts, you have any soap? I'll get some in the PX tomorrow. Hey Douglas, are you going to the laundry? Could you throw these in? Is it true Baker's wife is coming in from the mainland tomorrow? Yeah, that's what I heard. No wonder he's been grinning like a monkey all day. Hey Tom, is the comb placed above the soap dish for inspection? Look at the chart, moron. Ed, you finished? Help me with my brass so we can get out of here and get some burgers at the PX. Lopez, you want to come? No, I'm going to read the letter from my girl again. If we hurry, we can catch a few beers at the beer hall. That's another major part of the Army, drinking. The Army contains a large amount of drinkers. Sometimes we went over to the beer hall in small herds. After having enough beer, problems like KP and guard duty, and sergeants and officers and marching lose their importance, and stories of women and wine and good times back home are easier to remember. On some events in the Army which didn't seem at all funny at the time, you could laugh at. And I'll read that again. Or some events in the Army which didn't seem at all funny at the time could be laughed at. And any gripes about the Army which you can't express during the day come out faster and easier. There was a need for release, and drinking was a way to do it. Sometimes we released ourselves too much. That's when your buddies helped you back to the barracks and put you in bed. And that's when they made sure you got up for reveille. Reveille is at 6 a.m. every day except Sundays and holidays. That means if you stay up until 3 or 4 a.m. drinking, and with the aid of friends make it back to the barracks, you still have to be in uniform, standing at attention, arm raised in a salute as the cannon went off and the flag was raised. Sometimes this was an extremely difficult feat. After I had been at Schofield for about 8 or 9 months, and the company and the battalion were close to being filled, and things were almost organized, one of the guys got really settled and he bought a luxury item, a car, an old something or other that could make it to Waikiki and back. Normally we got off Saturday at 12 o'clock. We'd finish inspection at 10, wait 2 hours to practice waiting, and be released at noon. Then we changed, raced down to the orderly room for our passes, knowing we had to be back for reveille 6 o'clock Monday morning. He got into his car Saturday afternoon bound for Waikiki. I wasn't with him that weekend, but weekends in Waikiki have a certain flavor. The GI out for a good time. Waikiki is a very commercialized part of the island. The main street runs parallel to the beach, and everywhere a tourist or a GI or Hawaiian turns, there are restaurants, hotels, gift shops, and enough space between to fit a skinny surfer. One of the major objects of a GI at Waikiki is to find a woman. It was extremely hard. I found that Hawaiian girls preferred Hawaiian men, and girls from the mainland preferred Hawaiian men. They liked a good-looking, bronze, strong, virile Hawaiian in comparison to a pale, bald American GI. Prices in Hawaii were high, pay for GIs low. So requests such as, "Excuse me, miss, would you like to go to the 19-cent hamburger stand for a 10-cent Coke?" were fatal. There was a busy discotheque in town, which we tried occasionally. There were normally about 150 Navy, Marine, Air Force, and Army guys, and some civilians, and 23 girls. The dance floor was big enough for 10 couples, and if you were pushed off the dance floor because it was too crowded, you were pushed back on by an Hawaiian bouncer. Hawaiian bouncers are no people to be fooled around with. They are normally average height and as wide as 3 men. I always had the impression if I threw a punch at them with everything I had in it, they'd giggle. For whatever reason, my friends and myself usually found ourselves together with only a bottle of wine to console us. There is nothing like sitting on a lonely Waikiki beach at 3 in the morning, passing around a bottle of Thunderbird wine. Somebody would usually rent a hotel room, and about 7 or 8 of us would share the beds and the floor to kill the rest of the night. Then, Sunday, we'd wake up in the early afternoon to the Army beach on Waikiki, drink beer, lie in the sun, and look for girls. The guy with the car didn't have to worry about the last bus back, so he kept looking and drinking until about 4:30 a.m. We saw him stride into the barracks about 5:30 a.m., take a short 15-minute nap, get dressed, and fall out for a reveille. Monday, we went out to the field, walked around, climbed hills with packs on our backs, steel pots on our heads, and rifles in our hands. We dug foxholes and walked over more hills. We were driven back to the barracks in trucks and released at 5 p.m. He changed into civilian clothes, jumped in his car, and was off for Waikiki. He showed up again at 5:30 a.m., took a 15-minute nap, and got up for a reveille. He went out to the field again, more walking and digging and sweating, released at 5 p.m., and he was off again. He showed up at 5:40 a.m. and went to sleep. We went to his bunk, spoke to him, slapped his face a little, and pulled him into a sitting position. He stayed in that position for about a minute and keeled over. We pulled him to a sitting position again. He got up, got dressed, and he got to salute and hear the cannon go off. The next morning, we needed smelling salts, and the morning after that, smelling salts and a shower. That night, he decided to go to sleep early. You may wonder why anybody would subject his body to that kind of mistreatment. During the hours you're in the Army, almost everything is restricted and controlled. So the days when the Army releases you at 5 p.m. are important because that means you have 12 hours to use to do with as you wish without being watched, without being harassed, and choices like going to sleep or going to the service club to play bingo or ping pong or going to the library or gym or movie, choices that have been tried but lost their value when compared to Waikiki. So, he dragged his body through a day of training looking forward to the night ahead. He'd start to come alive about 4 o'clock. You could see his eyes starting to get fuller. Sometimes he would fall asleep out of class, so he'd be told to stand up so he could listen better. Actually, he wasn't the only person falling asleep in class. One of the most boring hours in the world is a 1-hour block of instruction. There was always a problem of people dozing off. They were told to stand or threatened with details, or when it got bad, not only the man who was sleeping, but the man sitting next to him was also guilty, which puts a person in the ticklish position of having to wake up a peacefully sleeping friend to listen to some more instruction that would tend to put him back to sleep. It was really difficult for me because I had been there almost from the beginning, so I must have gone to more repeat performances of a 1-hour block of instruction than anyone else there. On days when we stayed around the barracks, we normally had about 5 hours of classes split up for the day, and I had heard it all before. I always wished they would have given a test to see if I knew what they wanted me to know, so I wouldn't have to sit for 5 hours to hear again what I already knew. So, we were tested a couple of times while I was there, but it didn't matter. We were back at the classes a few days after the tests. I remember some days when we had the same class in the afternoon that we had that morning. There comes a point where you can't listen anymore and you just try to stay awake. I would be sitting on the grass in the shade of a tree. We weren't allowed to lean against the trunk of the tree because, being that relaxed, normally ended up in sleep. So, there would be about 80 of us sitting there. I'd wrap my arms around my knees and wait. Sometimes I got the feeling I was imprisoned in the 2nd grade, and no matter how studious I was, no matter how well I knew the lessons, I'd always get to hear the same lessons again and again, and would never be allowed into the 3rd grade. So you sit and try not to think. If you thought, you might come to the conclusion that you're being treated like a moron. You might think there are 40 minutes still to sit without thinking until the end of the class, and there's 1 more class that morning, and 3 more that afternoon, and 5 more tomorrow. And practically thinking, if you think about it at all, there's no end in sight. Actually, going into classes wasn't that bad. There are other activities a lot worse than that. It's the kind of mental attitude you acquire to sustain yourself, which means you can attain a certain amount of happiness sitting in the shade being treated like a moron in comparison to other things that could be happening. I sometimes got the feeling the instructors weren't happy about the situation either. It probably meant that they had to take time the previous night to make up a lesson plan. They had to repeat something that had been said either by themselves or some other sergeant many times before. And they had to do it to a group of people who were disinterested and sleeping. I know I wouldn't look forward to teaching in an atmosphere like that. There were also times instructors felt the same as the rest of the class. That is, the only reason they were there was because they were told to be there. There might be a little misunderstanding when I mention an instructor. I don't mean a specialized teacher who comes around to each company and gives his class and leaves. Our instructors were the same sergeants and officers that told us to clean the latrines, get a haircut, and sometimes they got as fed up with teaching the same faces, the same things as we got to listen. That's what happens in the Army. There are times when orders come down from the higher-ups, as they are called, which are hard for anyone on the company level to carry out. The people who send down the orders know the men have to be trained, but they don't have to teach it. I'll read that again. The people who send down the orders know the men have to be trained, but they don't have to listen to the same classes over and over again, and they don't have to teach it. Since they don't have to live through the hardships that orders produce, they find it easy to send more orders down. There are times when there is an enormous lack of understanding from the charts and drawing boards and plans that are put down on paper and what is actually happening with the people who have to carry out the decisions that have been made. To understand this gap, you have to understand the structure of the Army. First, the man on the bottom, the clerk, infantrymen, the player in the band. We're in for 2, 3, or 4 years, whatever we signed for, and then we leave the Army. Then there's the man who decides to make the Army his career. There's free food, free rent, free medical care, security benefits, and there are some good, interesting jobs in the Army. That's where the Army is very much like civilian life. If someone decides to stay in the Army, he has decided he likes his job and he will try to advance in that job to have more benefits, to be in a better position, and receive more pay. And as in any job, to get a better position, you have to please your boss to get ahead. So, if some majors and colonels and generals get together and decide on something and then tell a company commander to do it, if he has any intention of becoming a major, which is the next step up, he better get it done. I know there must have been times when an order came down that was no good for the men. Maybe they've been out in the field for 3 days sweating and walking and digging and could use a quiet day of classes to give them a chance to rest. And an order comes down for 3 more days of walking and digging. And the CO, the company commander, would like to say, my men are very tired, they've been pushing for days, last night it rained on them, and the chow truck didn't show up, and I know if they had to walk 3 more days, they could, because they've done it for me before, and I don't think it's necessary for them to do this again. And I'd appreciate it if you would send some trucks out here to bring us in. But there are very few COs who would say that because their careers are on the line. If an order is given and it isn't carried out, there is something wrong. Maybe you can't be trusted to carry out orders in the future. Maybe you can't control your men. If a captain wants to be a major, he can't leave doubts like that in his superiors' minds. There were also captains who went to the other extreme. If the higher-ups weren't asking enough, he'd volunteer some of his own men for special duties to please his superiors. Captains would compete with other captains in battalions to have the best company, best marching, best looking, and best discipline. We spent many, many hours marching to get better than the other companies. The CO is in charge of the whole company. Then there's the top sergeant in the company who's in charge of all sergeants and everyone below the rank of sergeant. The average top sergeant has been in the Army at least 15 years. He knows a lot about the Army, about its regulations, about disciplining men. He has gone through years of Army life. He is an old hand at the Army game and knows much of the tricks. He gives the captain advice and assistance, and sometimes he wonders how a young kid like that, with less than a thimbleful of years and experience, was put in charge of a company. When he's given an order, he has to consider that he's put in 15 years into the job. He doesn't want to throw away his pension, his security, his position, his career over a few ridiculous orders. He's gone through the normal Army mistakes and weathered them. It won't be that bad on the men. In fact, in some cases, it will do them good. He has gone through it years ago, and although he probably didn't like it at the time, it's part of being in the Army, and if you manage to make it through and learn while doing it, then here's their chance. He's also looking to please the CO, so his prospects of getting ahead are bettered. He also does this by maintaining good discipline from the sergeant below him, who also put in a good many years in the service and are looking to prove themselves. While this is going on at a company level, colonels are trying to prove that they have the best battalions, and generals are competing against generals for brigades. Another reason for carrying out an order is that if you don't carry out an order, you can be fined or busted to a lower rank, or placed at a worse job, or imprisoned. All kinds of reasons, from profit gains and personal gains to jail, occur when an order is passed on. While all this competing for jobs is going on, the men at the bottom, whose only job is to count the remaining days, pay the price. We huddle at the bottom, wondering what we are going to be told to do next. Normally, we don't have to wait long. We learn to put up with it. It costs us hours and days of frustration and sweat and fatigue. But we lived with it and went out and drank beer when we were released. Another facet of the Army, and mostly reserved for the privileged infantrymen, is the field. Camping out, fighting nature and the enemy. There's a mountain range on the north side of the island known as the Cahookas. They'd put us in trucks and drive us out there, drop us off and pick us up about 3 days later. We jump out of the trucks. To an infantryman, jumping out of a truck is comparable to leaving the womb. You're out in the cold, hard world of walking. And that's what we do. We normally follow old dirt roads. The dirt on the island was a red clay, and during the dry season, which lasts about 9 months, the clay becomes red dust. Whenever we returned to the barracks, we would be covered with a thin red layer of dust. The dust cost us a lot of trouble at inspections because all our equipment was not allowed to show any sign whatsoever of the red dust. This means washing and scrubbing everything we own, including our bodies, until no red was showing. We'd walk on the sides of the road. There would be a long line of men on each side of the road, and there would be about 30 feet between them, so the whole formation took up close to half a mile. Normally, it would be a nice sunny day, temperatures between 80 and 90 degrees. I'd be wearing my favorite green army fatigues and steel helmet. Steel pots, as they're referred to, have the ability of gathering and intensifying the heat of the sun in a valiant attempt to boil the blood in your head. I'd be carrying a pack with a poncho and mess kit. For inspections, the poncho, which is a piece of water-repellent material about 5 feet wide and 6 feet long, had to be folded into a square about 8 by 8 inches. When we were out in the field and it started to rain, there were times when we decided it was easier to get wet than refold the poncho. I also carried a rifle that weighed about 6 pounds. There were some really unfortunate men who had to carry machine guns which weighed about 25 pounds, and other men who had to carry rocket launchers which are similar to the bazookas they used in World War II. They weighed 35 pounds. I never understood how they managed to carry them. There were several times during different field trips I had the extreme problem of carrying myself. Sometimes we went through terrain that was the dense jungle type. If Tarzan had tried to swing on a vine, he'd swing about 3 feet and crash into a tree. One exercise we went on was during the rainy season, when the red clay dust turned to mud, and every step I would take implanted my leg up to the same point where a footlocker would get it. Every time I took a step, I had to pull my trailing leg out of the mud, which had the strength of about 9,352 suction cups. Sometimes, if I pulled my leg out fast enough, I could hear a pop. It was a good place to have friends. A couple of times men got both legs locked into the mud up to their knees, and the more they struggled, the deeper they got, until they were rescued. We walked through this type of mud for about 10 miles. We were really happy about the 10 miles after that because it was dry ground. Anyone who gets tired thinking about walking a mile on paved street would really have gotten a thrill out of that. We went on a major operation with the tactical assistance of the Navy. They got a couple of battalions together, drove them down to the pier, and loaded them onto Navy troop ships. The whole idea was a huge amphibious assault against the deserted part of another Hawaiian island called Molokai. We got out to sea and we practiced climbing up and down the We got out to sea and we practiced climbing up and down those huge nets you see in the war movies, the ones that GIs climb down, that hang down the side of the ship and into the launching craft. The launching crafts look like a large metal box. When they hit the beach, the big metal door in front falls down, and the GIs come rushing out, screaming and charging up the beach. The day of the real assault, there were important generals and civilians and people from the Pentagon who came to see the assault. We were told to yell and scream for them. After we hit the beach, the other part of the operation was to start walking inland to capture or defeat the aggressors. The aggressors were the Army Reservists of Hawaii, who were also called upon for the operation. They wore dark green aggressor uniforms, so it would be easier to know who they were. We walked a little that afternoon, and we walked that night. We got some sleep, and then we woke up the next morning, folded up our sleeping gear, which is a poncho and lightweight blanket, had some sea rations for breakfast, and started to walk again. It was starting to get hot, and it was the dry season on Molokai. We walked through streams and creeks, some 5 feet deep, and they were all dried up. Most of us had less than 1 canteen of water when we started out that morning. We were walking on a rocky plateau. Off to my left, a couple of 100 feet down, was the ocean, pounding against the rocks. The place was almost completely barren. No water, no trees, just a few kinds of crazy vegetation who decided to live there. And there we were, Company B, moving ahead slowly, sweat pouring out of pores that had never been used before. Our steel pots gathering heat, low on spirit and low on water. After a couple of hours of the Death Valley of Molokai, some of the guys didn't have any water left, and we were still walking. We were taking turns carrying the machine guns and 35-pound rocket launchers. At 11 o'clock, after walking for about 3 hours with a few short breaks, things started to get worse. The sun was getting hotter and the water was getting lower, and most important, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know how much further we had to walk, and we didn't know if we were going to get any more water in the near future. It was getting to the point where it was difficult taking the next step. It's hard to keep walking if you don't know whether it's for 2 more miles or 5 or 10. If we knew we were going to stop soon, it would have been easier, but our only information was keep walking. We walked another endless hour. The sun was blazing, and still there was no end in sight. I had felt like passing out a few times, but held on. That's another thing about the Army. The infantry in particular. There's an unwritten code that of being at least as physically fit as the next man. Anything the rest of the men could do to suffer through and be able to keep going is a standard that must be met. I knew I wasn't the strongest man in the company, but I wasn't willing to prove I was the weakest. I knew the same thought was going through everyone's head, so we all kept walking, and growing weaker until someone's body decided in protest that he couldn't take the punishment anymore. After the first man collapsed, almost simultaneously, 7 other guys passed out. We used most of the remaining water to keep them cool until the choppers, the helicopters, arrived. They medevaced them out and brought us food and water. We rested for about 2 hours and started walking again. We spent the day until close to nightfall walking and looking for aggressors. I never saw one dark green uniform. Before night came, we found a place to set up camp. We got in a perimeter defense, spread out ponchos on the ground, and prepared for sleep. But you don't just go to sleep for the night. You don't get a full, quiet night's sleep on a cold, hard ground and wake up fresh and lively, ready to start the next day. There's guard duty to be considered. That means 2 hours of sitting up looking for the enemy in the dark. 2 long hours with nothing to do, no one to talk to, and the most immediate thought you have is of collapsing into a sound, peaceful, well-earned sleep. 2 hours of silence. The loudest noise is you swallowing. Take a watch with a second hand and see how long it takes to go 30 seconds. Now multiply that by 240 times, and that's how long it takes to sit 2 hours. Multiply that 5 times for fatigue. Multiply twice for boredom, and 10 times for ever allowing yourself to get into a situation like that. After eternity of guard duty, there's 4 hours of sleep, which normally takes about 10 minutes. Hey. What? Your turn. My turn? I just went to sleep. Your turn. 2 more hours of guard duty. Multiply the whole thing by 100 twice. The next morning we got up with the sun, had a sea ration breakfast, rolled up our gear and started to walk. We walked until we had the same feeling we had the day before. Fortunately, we had guarded our water more carefully, so there were no more casualties. Later on in the afternoon, we saw one of the most beautiful sights we'd ever seen, a line of parked trucks. We slowly started walking toward them, not really believing they were there. We looked at each other in amazement, and some of the broadest grins I have ever seen started to take shape on some of the happiest, dirtiest faces I had ever seen. There were a few yells of joy, many sighs of relief, and a wild stampede for the trucks. We got back to the beach, back to the ships, back to the pier, and back to the barracks. We had been gone about 10 days, and the barracks looked good after that trip. We unpacked our gear and started to get ready for the next inspection. After I was there about 9 or 10 months, the company was about full strength. The battalion was decently organized, and things started to fall into a more or less steady routine. We'd go out to the Cahucas Monday, Tuesday, and sometimes Wednesday, clean the dust off when we got back that night so it didn't penetrate so deeply. Then we'd have classes Thursday and Friday, have an inspection Saturday morning, go to Waikiki from Saturday to Monday morning, and start the next week. We knew what to expect most of the time. We did that for a couple of months, and things were pretty calm. Occasionally we saw a monkey wrench fly by, but other than that, it started to take on the proportions of a job. Working with the same men every day, getting laughs just being together because we had been together a while and had gotten to know each other and like each other. It was really nice and calm for a while. Some men who were married had their wives fly out and live in the government housing or private housing, some on post and some right nearby. That gave us a little more room in the barracks and also gave us a nice place to go for an occasional home-cooked dinner with quiet talk and just a plain ordinary good time. Some guys left the company and the Army because their time was up. They had served their time and they were leaving. If you want to find a real happy person, find a guy who has a few days left in the Army. He'll be easy to find. He'll be the one dancing on the chow line. It was good to see them go because it made them happy, and I could count my days with a little more assurance that my day would come. I had already been in 2 years. I had reached the halfway point 6 months earlier. I was really getting into the downhill side of time. A year is a very long time, but I had already survived 2. Another very important part of the Army is mail call. Every day, if we were not in the field, we'd descend upon the mailroom door. There'd be about 100 of us trying to get into a better position to hear our names called. Mail was our link with the outside world, and we were all wondering if anyone back home still cared enough to write. Friends, parents, girlfriends, anyone. Without trying to look too anxious, we stood there with our tongues hanging out, waiting for our name to be mentioned. It was a lot easier to go to an afternoon of classes with a letter in your pocket. Sometimes the news from the mainland wasn't so good. Some of the guys found it was difficult keeping a girlfriend with the Pacific Ocean between them. And a guy would get a Dear John letter, which explained in whatever terms his girlfriend used that it was all over. One day, one of the men opened the letter, and you could tell by the expression on his face he wasn't too happy. One of his buddies asked him what was wrong. He looked up from his letter and said, just got a Dear John letter from his mother. That kept us smiling for a couple of days. Also around this time, the company armourer, the man in charge of making sure the rifles and other weapons were clean and locked up and accounted for, was ready to leave the Army. His time was up and they needed a new armourer. I didn't know how important getting the job was at the time, but God knew. When I first started, we still didn't know we were going to Vietnam. There were still occasional rumors, the same ones I have been hearing for a year. The job itself made living a lot better than before. I didn't have to go to classes, and I didn't have to go out to the field. I even got an assistant to help out, and I actually avoided some of the inspections. Just about the time when things were getting to be really good, a nice quiet routine in the company, and I had my new and better position, the rumors got more frequent and heavier. And then men with 6 months or less left in the army were being transferred out. Husbands were advised to send their wives back to the mainland, and we were issued special jungle fatigues and jungle boots, and a whole load of new equipment was issued to each company. It wasn't long before we knew we were going. We just didn't know when. One of the hardest parts of the whole thing was riding home. Most of us waited until the very end when we were positive we were going. I knew it was going to be hard on my parents. I had already been in 2 years and 3 months, with only 9 months to go. They always worried from the time I was inducted that I was going over, and I knew that they were starting to feel easier with only 9 months left. The Army had another large task on its hand, the transporting an entire brigade of men and equipment, everything from silverware to typewriters to trucks, all to be loaded on ships, along with men and supplies, and taken across the ocean. We started wrapping equipment in waterproof paper and packed them into crates and then into large metal boxes which were big enough to hold Volkswagen sedans. The metal boxes were hoisted onto trucks and driven to the pier and loaded. We left the barracks bare, locked the doors, and left the place almost as I had found it 15 months earlier. The night before we left, we were given passes. I went down to a friend's home with a couple of buddies. We had a beautiful spaghetti dinner, laughed and joked, and tried to forget where we were going the next day. There were a few flashes in my mind about not showing up, but I didn't really consider them. Everybody in my company was there the next day. We talked and kidded around, but you could tell there was a part of everyone's mind thinking about what lay ahead. There were a few flashes in my mind about We left on December 5th, my brother's birthday. It took about 2 weeks to make it across. Riding on a troop ship is an experience all its own. There was still KP and other details and classes, but for the most part, the trip was spent reading or sleeping or playing cards. Details are like just chores, jobs that you're given to do from the sergeant or whoever. There were a couple of days when the majority of men spent most of their time in the head or the bathroom recirculating some of the food they had eaten. It got very monotonous after a few days. The ship was constantly rolling and the scenery never changed. The sea is a vast place, and that's all we saw for 2 weeks, water and sky. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do. There was plenty of time to think. Trying to see into the future, wondering what was going to happen when we got there, what kind of place we were bound for. There were men lying around the decks who wouldn't be alive in a few months. I wondered whether I was going to be one of them. We sometimes spoke of a beautiful hope that we'd all come back alive and well, and we'd know deep within us it couldn't happen. But if I looked around, I didn't want to imagine any one of the men I was sitting or eating with and sleeping with and playing cards with to be any less alive than he was at that moment. We were going to Nam under very different circumstances than most men do. Usually, if a man goes over, the men he ends up fighting with are men he doesn't know. He might even be sent over with a company of men he trained with, but when they arrive in Nam, they go to a replacement unit, and then the men are broken up and sent to different units wherever they are needed. A new man finds himself in a new company with many unknown faces, and in some respects it's much easier that way. When one of these unknown faces gets shot, and a chopper comes in and takes him back to the hospital, the new man would feel sorry for the guy, but on an impersonal basis. You read about 50,000 people dying every year on the highways, but if no one you know got hurt, it doesn't have much of an effect. After a new man gets to know some of the men in the unit, when a chopper comes in, it hurts a lot more. In that sense, it was going to be hard for us. We were not a group of strangers thrown together on a battlefield. We had a past of inspections and field trips and parades and Waikiki and beer halls and classes and miserable days and good laughs. It was going to be very hard. The ships glided into the harbor. Patrol boats came out to meet us. Almost everybody was out on deck taking pictures and looking. The men down on the docks were quietly and efficiently getting the ship tied down and ready to be unloaded. I was tense, worried about what was going to happen. Thoughts of being attacked while still on the ships. But the guys on shore seemed calm about the whole thing, going about their business. I became a little less apprehensive, commonly known as scared. They worked late into the night, into the early morning. We were put into trucks and driven to a marshalling area to wait for the sun. We were still within the security of Queen Nam. The major bases of Nam were relatively secure, although there's always the threat of a mortar attack. When the sun came out, the trucks started on their way. We had to travel 80 miles north on Highway 1. Highway 1, except for a few paved parts, was the size of a two-way highway made of dirt, dust, and holes. Everybody was on edge because all the classes we had gone to, which described how large convoys of trucks were ambushed. The vehicles were large 2.5-ton trucks. We sat in the back. The canvas backs were off so we could see the countryside and possible snipers. We were sitting on sandbags which were placed on the bottom in the back of the truck. If the trucks went over a mine, the sandbags would slow down some of the shrapnel pieces of jagged metal. We had our rifles ready, and there were machine guns sitting on the top of the cab of the truck with someone standing behind it. Everyone was very aware, cautious, tense, something like walking in Central Park at 3 in the morning. The countryside was flat and open for long distances, with mountains in the background. As we drove past, some Vietnamese were walking, some on bicycles, some on small motorbikes. Our bodies were starting to acclimate to the heat. Sometimes I forgot about the heat because it's part of every day, but it's very hot and it's very real. The people wore very thin clothing like pajama material. The kids would wave to us and ask us for candy or cigarettes or food from our sea rations. I saw beautiful old monuments sitting out in the middle of the fields. When we went through a village, there'd be a line of little shacks. They were made of anything they could find. Corrugated tin for the roofs, flattened tin cans, flattened cardboard boxes, thatched roofs, dirt walls, dirt floors. No plumbing, no electricity. It's amazing how many things we take for granted. We were tourists in an old land. We lived there for a year and left, and they stayed there all their lives without the comforts we gave up for a year. Living their lives year after year on a land that has seen no peace in many, many years. As we drove through the village, parents and old people would be standing outside or squatting, and they'd just watch us go by very solemnly while the children waved and shouted. We bounced in the back of the truck for about 5 hours until we arrived at Duck Phone. In among the fields of rice paddies, the army sectioned off a part of land, put barbed wire around it, and built sandbag bunkers. It was a fairly large area, with one part made of flat land and the other part a very small mountain or a very large hill. Near the center, large tents were set up for the administration part of the battalion. Each company had a tent that had 6 men and small amounts of supplies. For the first couple of weeks, we got things a little more organized in the supply tent, while the rest of the company was going to more classes. Occasionally, at night, some shots would come into the perimeter, and they fired back. In a way, even in Nam, even though we all knew we were in a war, it hadn't showed itself yet. The games we played in Hawaii had just been moved, still wearing the same clothes, using the same weapons, going through the same procedures. There had been no orders that had come down for any of the companies to go out on any missions. The higher-ups knew they had a new group of men, all inexperienced, and they first wanted them to get used to the weather and the surroundings. We had 2 older sergeants who had been in the Korean War, but the rest of the company had never gone through a war. That was another difference arriving in a brigade. Usually men are placed into outfits who have been fighting, who knew how to react in certain situations, who knew what to look for. There is a confidence that the new man has, knowing the man next to him had gone through it and knows what to do. Our company didn't have that confidence. There was no veterans alongside you to depend on, to turn to follow. We were all still a little worried about being anything, because anything could happen, but we were also a little lax because nothing had. One night, about 8 men from another company went out on a night ambush. We were sitting in the tent with a Coleman lantern going, quietly talking or reading when the news got back that the patrol had returned and one of the men had been shot and killed. There was a silence, and there was a quiet dread thought that the games were over, that there was death lurking in this country and its jaws were just starting to open, and the whites were turning to gray and the grays would turn black. My company started to go out on missions. They'd get in troop helicopters, fly out somewhere, get out, look for the North Vietnamese, not finding anything, and be brought back. And then they went out on another mission. They met some enemy small arms fire, and one of those enemy bullets traveled through space and stopped in a man's body, and he was dead. And his 1-month-old marriage died, and the guys said if he had stayed lower, that wouldn't have happened. And that was a good excuse, because no one had any other reason why he was dead, but he was. So they all decided to stay lower. That was the answer. It turned out that wasn't the answer. It turned out there was no answer. First, I wondered why he died. Why him and not someone else? Why was he chosen? Maybe because of his background. Maybe because it was his turn to go. There could have been any number of reasons for him. But then after a short while, men were dying and being wounded and being maimed, and there was no common factor. There were short and tall, black and white from all parts of the country. And when I finally gave up looking for a reason why one became a victim while another didn't, when I finally had to admit to myself there was no answer, no easy way to go through the rest of the day, no way of saying to yourself, I know why Miller lost his leg today. He lost his leg because I didn't know why. I didn't know why Eaton was lying in a bed in the hospital. I didn't understand how an old-timer who made it through the Korean War didn't make it through this one. Then I started to wonder why anyone was dying. Why were we in Vietnam? And I slowly began to realize that the reasons we had been told back in the States, the reasons we grew up with, were not true. I had been told we were fighting to help the South Vietnamese, to give them a government of their own choosing, to give them a chance to grow as a free people, to protect their rights as free people. That is why I was willing to go to Vietnam. But what I actually saw in Nam was not even close to the ideals I had heard about. We brought men and weapons into Vietnam to protect Vietnamese freedom, and I found out we were taking away their freedom. I found out the attitude toward the Vietnamese people was to treat them as less than people. There is a large gap of feeling and understanding between the American soldier and the Vietnamese. Most fighting men don't trust them because of the way they live and the language they speak. They don't respect the South Vietnamese soldier because they don't trust him while fighting alongside of him. They don't respect the Vietnamese people because they do our laundry, clean our buildings, fill our sandbags, polish our boots, wash our dishes, and women sacrifice their bodies, all for the almighty American dollar. Vietnamese people are commonly referred to as dinks or gooks by the large majority of American personnel. Would you lay down your life for the freedom of a gook? The people whose freedom we're fighting for have become our servants. Men bought cigarettes and beer and dishes and other things at the PX and sold them to the Vietnamese to make money off the war and the people they were fighting for. Most of the men in the field were not fighting for Vietnamese freedom. They were fighting for their own lives. They weren't fighting for idealistic principles. They weren't fighting for long-range goals. They were taking each day and trying to get through it alive and in one piece. While the rest of the company was out fighting, I was at base camp. I and about 5 other men had the job of resupplying the men out in the field. Every day they got a new supply of sea rations, 1 hot meal, ammunition, and mail, and anything else they needed. New fatigues, a toothbrush, cleaning equipment for the weapons, mosquito repellent, boots. Every once in a while we moved. The first time we moved, we went from Duc Pho to Chu Lai. Chu Lai was about 40 miles north of Duc Pho, right on the coast. Chu Lai was immense. It was like the difference between Rhode Island and Texas. It was a major Marine, Army, and Navy and Air Force base. It had PXs the size of airplane hangars with cameras and towels and magazines and pretzels and jewelry and bathing suits and watches. There were also beer halls. Sometimes they had live entertainment. It had been 3 or 4 hospitals and a replacement center where new men waited to be assigned. Paved roads, electricity, movies at night. There were certain areas that had air conditioning, mostly around important officers. There was an airport that had bombers that were constantly leaving and landing. Chu Lai was something like Los Angeles. Many different units, but all spread out. It also had running water for showers. Different units, but all spread. It had also running water for showers. One of the men had made a shower using a 55-gallon barrel, but normally the amount of effort to carry enough water from the water tanks and up the ladder to the barrel was enough to consider not taking frequent showers. We moved 2 more times while I was there, but they were short hauls. People in Duc Pho moved about a mile to the left to a place a little larger with permanent wooden buildings, a small airfield, electricity, showers, fans, and refrigerators. The difference in size between Rhode Island and Connecticut. We moved again within Chu Lai from one side of the Highway 1 to the other, and then we had permanent wooden buildings, fans, refrigerators, and other conveniences. We had radio contact with the company out in the field, and every night they call up for a resupply list. The following morning we got the supplies together, which sometimes involved riding around Chu Lai in one of our jeeps looking for a place that might have what we needed. After a while there was always extra men besides us who were back from the field, men who had gotten out of the hospital and were recovering before they were sent back to the field, men who came in to see doctors and dentists, and men who were leaving on R&R, rest and recuperation, and others who were new replacements. When they did come in from the field, we tried to make sure to drive them over to the showers and the PX and the beer halls and movies, whatever was available, because they didn't have any of those things obviously out in the field. A very sad thing happened while we were there, to everyone. It happened slowly and gradually, and no one noticed when it happened. We began slowly with each death and every casualty until there were so many deaths and so many wounded, we started to treat death and loss of limb with callousness, and it happens because the human mind can't hold that much suffering and survive. Parts of my job was to clean the weapons of the dead and wounded. It would be hot outside, and I would roll up the side of the tent in the morning to let in a fresh breeze and let in the light. I'd sit down at a little wooden table with rags and brushes and cleaning rods and cleaning solvents, and the smell of the solvents would be heavily mixed with the heat of the day. And my mind would be heavy with memories of the men that used to own the weapons, and I'd wipe away the dried up blood and the bits of flesh, and I tried not to vomit. I was working one night in the orderly room at Schofield. about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Sergeant Hill staggered in. He was a drinker, but he had outdone himself. I guess he was in his late 30s, big, round, jovial, big round body. He was feeling good. He was in the kind of mood to sit down and have a good heart-to-heart talk with anyone. So he asked me if I'd help him up the stairs so he could talk to his squad. He was feeling so good I didn't have the heart to mention his squad might be sleeping at 3 in the morning. He and I struggled up the stairs. He was really leaning on me for support. He must have weighed 40 pounds more than I did. We made it up to his squad, and he quietly and compassionately started at the first bed. He warmly greeted, had a short discussion, and some laughs with the first man, and then went on to the next. He woke up all 10 men in the squad. Not one of them got mad at him for waking him up because they all knew how great he was feeling. And they talked with him and laughed with him until we decided it was time for him to get some sleep to prepare for reveille. One of the men in the squad got dressed and helped him down the stairs over to another barracks and up another set of stairs. Somehow he made it to reveille and made it through the day. But he was digging a foxhole in Nam, and his shovel hit a mine, and that was his last day. And then Miller's rifle, the time we got completely and utterly smashed at the beer hall, we came back to the barracks feeling boisterous and obnoxious, and feeling that the only thing to be done, the only feasible idea to be considered, as we stood on the second floor balcony looking at the banana tree, was to satisfy a strange and sudden craving for a bunch of bananas. We weren't feeling strong enough to leap from the second floor and grab the bananas, so we went down and started up. I got up on Miller's shoulders since he was 6'4" and 210 pounds, and I wasn't. I started up a tree. Every ounce of physical and mental energy was focused on that bunch of bananas. Nothing was going to stop me. Miller was yelling encouragement from below, and some of the guys were out on a balcony waving and shouting. I got level with the bunch. I hung on to the trunk and reached out and pulled and yanked and twisted, and it wouldn't budge. I was getting furious, and there was more shouting. I yanked and pulled and cursed, and still no bananas. It had gotten far beyond the point of saying, well, why don't we forget about the bananas? The crowd wanted the bananas. I had decided to leave the safety of the trunk and edged out onto the limb. The limbs on banana trees have the consistency of very thick leaves. There are two kinds of people who would go out on a limb of a banana tree: a fool and a drunk. I still couldn't pull the bunch off. I was hanging from the limb, looking up at the sky. I wrapped my legs around the limb and slowly and serenely leaned away from the tree. I, the limb, and the bananas hit the ground simultaneously. After we found out I was alive, the best thing we could do was laugh our heads off. Miller got a 5-foot wooden board. I held the bananas, and in a drunken frenzy he lashed out at the limb until the bananas were separated, and we triumphantly staggered, bananas in hand, up the stairs and to bed. Miller thought there was a mine in the path, and he attached his bayonet to his rifle and probed the area and lost a foot. Just a foot. Those are the values in Nam after a while. He's lucky. He only lost a foot. And there was Sergeant Lawson's rifle. He was a tall, well-built black man who had made the Army his career, who liked its security, its pay, and its challenges in peacetime, but he hated the war. He had gotten his rank much faster than the average career man because he was good at his job and he was diligent. Sometimes we had talks about things other than the Army. He talked about when he raced cars, and he talked about his kids and how he was going to bring them up. I disagree with some of the things he said and suggested he read certain books about kids, and he did. And we talked about that, and he talked about his wife, and I could feel how much he cared for his family when he discussed them. We got to like each other, although we really couldn't express it because we were of different ranks, and Army discipline did not allow for that. We once went down to Waikiki together to hear Ray Charles. While we were there, a group of about 3 or 4 black men were making loud noises and whistling while some females were performing. He got up and went over to them. I don't know what he said, but they were quiet when he got back. He was proud of being black, and he didn't want other black men lowering the respect of his race deserved. I went to his house once, and it was beautiful to see the happiness that was in that home. The kids were on the floor playing with coloring books and crayons, laughing, and his wife came and really made me feel welcome, not just another guest. I had the feeling the sergeant had told her about me, and she liked what she had heard, and she was really glad to see me. When we got to Nam, and he went out to the field and saw men dying around him, I could see the times he came back to the base camp, the fear in his eyes. The fear of losing what he had back home to a useless, senseless war. I could see him thinking he might never make love to his wife again. He might never hold his children again. And he stepped off to the side of the path and put his boot, on part of the earth that screamed death. And I lost a friend, 2 children lost a father, and a wife lost a wonderful man. There wasn't much left of him. 2 of us went down to the morgue to identify his body, and they opened a long drawer from a wall, pulled back the plastic, and we nodded, and I thought, yeah, that's the guy I went to Ray Charles with. And it goes on day after day. If nobody gets killed or maimed or wounded in our country that day, another company has its day. The first time I went to the hospital, I went to see someone in the intensive care ward, and I knew before I went through the doors I didn't want to be there. And I walked down the aisle trying not to look, and seeing tubes running into men's arms, faces covered with bandages, arms and legs wrapped in bandages. I remember one man with a tube in his throat. I passed all of them and found the man in our company. I stood on one side of the bed and the doctor on the other. He asked me what had happened, and I tried to explain, and I was looking at the man lying there, and his head was bandaged, and there were little bits of metal in his face, and I was growing weaker. And the room was starting to tilt, and with whatever strength I had, I started walking down the aisle, concentrating on the door, and made it outside and leaned over the railing and took deep gulps of air. Long, deep gulps until I was all right. I knew that I had to go back in because I was one of the few people who had the choice to bring mail, or a chance, to bring mail and cigarettes and candy, and to ask if there was anything else I could get, and to let them know that somebody cared that they were in the hospital. After a while, I was able to walk into a hospital ward without hesitating, and able to talk freely with someone who had been wounded or lost a limb as if nothing had happened, like it was another everyday occurrence. And I'd tell them some of the things happening with the company, and find out if they needed anything, and somewhere in the back of my mind there was the portion of it vomiting. The competition to get a higher rank or a better position that went on at Schofield continued in Nam. The only difference in Nam was that when an order came down, it wasn't in the best interest of the men, as orders came down at Schofield, and no one stopped those orders, as they did not stop them at Schofield. Then the men paid with their lives instead of sweat and frustration. I found out that hospital beds and plastic bags were being filled because of a lack of interest on the part of human beings. Before we started operations, before we got to Nam, battalion commanders had been given maps where minefields had been laid. This was good because knowing where minefields are could save a lot of lives and a lot of misery. But for whatever inhuman reason they had, orders were sent down to walk companies through those minefields. And the maps had been right. And they proved it with the casualties that we suffered. The best way to prove that a company or a battalion is better than another in Nam is to kill more of the enemy or find weapon caches or tunnels, all of which involve men being out in the field. With more men out in the field for longer periods of time, you have a better chance of doing these deeds. And there were times those men were sent out and kept out far beyond any consideration for their well-being. Each man in Nam went out in the field carries about 50 pounds of weight on his back, and he walks without weight in temperatures sometimes over 100 degrees. And there were times he was told to do that for 30 days. 30 days without a shower, without a full night's sleep. And the people who told them to be out there, some of them had never been out there. Some of them went out in choppers and viewed it from the air. Some of them got out and walked with the troops for a while and got back in choppers and thought they had an idea of what it was like out there. But they sent out orders, and the men grew weak from the heat and the walking and the weight and the dead and the wounded, and they were told to keep walking. And they grew less alert, and they made mistakes, and mistakes in Vietnam are costly. While I was there for 9 months, my company had stand down twice. Stand down is when they are taken out of the field and allowed to rest without any details, without any guard duty. There were times they were out of the field on landing zones or fire bases, but they still had guard duty at night. They pulled KP, they built bunkers. The infantry is the workhorse of the army, and the work is never finished. The infantryman bears almost the whole misery of the war. His tour of duty is 12 months, and he is supposed to get one out-of-country rest and recuperation, which lasts about 5 days, once in that 12 months. When they came in for doctor's appointments and administrative reasons, there were sergeants in base camps who made sure they got their business done as quickly as possible so that they could be flown back out to the field. When they came in from the field, they were normally harassed and put on details and watched over until they were back in the field. Instead of leaving them alone, instead of letting them rest until their appointment time, they were forced into details. They were not allowed to go into the local village to drink beer and buy trinkets and use the Vietnamese women. They were not allowed. But the sergeants, who made sure these men didn't have a chance to enjoy themselves, used the town when they wanted to. There are men in the lower ranks in the armed forces in Nam who never get to pick up a rifle. They have soft jobs in secure places. Some have housemaids and air conditioning. Some, because of their position, get to go on 3 or 4 or 5 R&R trips who never take one step out in the field, who never have KP, and while they enjoy their good luck and privileges, the infantryman gets to enjoy nothing. So when the company did come in for stand down, when they did get a chance to relax and let go without guard duty, KP, and details and harassment, one of the major items we made sure was on hand was beer. Beer is a major commodity in Nam. It comes in shiploads. Huge areas were fenced off in July with tiers and tiers of beer. Warehouses full, beer halls full, enough beer to drown Rhode Island. We had a huge beer party for a couple of days. They laughed and joked and played volleyball and basketball, and they slept and relaxed and had 3 hot meals a day and had showers and got clean clothes. It was good to see them again. It was wonderful to know they weren't out in the field, that they were in a safe place without having to worry about mines and firefights and death, at least for a short while. We'd drink more beer at night, go to the movies in the mess hall, and then usually the men who smoked pot went off a little ways so the odor wasn't too strong. Pot is about as easy to get as beer. I had first tried pot back in the States before I went into the Army, and because of all the stories and rumors I heard about it, I was afraid to use it. The stories about losing your mind or losing control, I was afraid that with my mental defenses down, I might find out something about myself too unbearable to know. I tried some with a friend who had smoked before, and the first couple of times I did smoke, nothing happened. He said this was usual because pot isn't that strong, and if you tighten up your mind because of fear, it doesn't have an effect. The next couple of times, after relaxing more, it did take effect, and I found out for myself, as everyone has to, that there is nothing to be afraid of, and there is a lot to enjoy. It's also fun to watch someone who's trying to pot for the first couple of times. When they start to relax and become less anxious, a grin starts to form on their faces and starts to grow, and if you ask them how they're feeling, they'll deny feeling any better. No, I still don't feel anything. And their smile would get bigger, and they start to laugh and start to enjoy themselves. It's always beautiful seeing someone being happy. Unfortunately, it normally takes alcohol or pot or tranquilizers or something to do it. I smoked pot and numb so I wouldn't have to think about what was going on, and I drank beer for the same reason. I didn't grow up with people dying around me. I had never seen a man shot. I had never spoken to a man who had his leg blown off. I had never seen killing and death. The only person I ever saw dead was when I was very young. I was leaving my house to go to school in the early morning, when the air was crisp and the sun was giving a faint yellow glow to the buildings, and I saw a man lying in the street with a white sheet over his head, and a police car and a garbage truck nearby, and it was very calm, and there was no interested people around, just me going to school in the winter morning. And I saw the dead man, and I saw the shortness of life because he had ended his life that day by being hit by a garbage truck. And for him, the street wasn't there, or the police car, or me, but it was still there because I saw it. And I wondered that day when my last glimpse of the world would be watched by someone. That was my nearest touch with death, and I was trying to live through now. I tried to live with a radio that kept us in touch with the men out in the field. I hated that radio and feared it. The radio let us know who just died and who was another casualty. It was almost like being out in the field because we always knew what was going on, especially when things went badly. We'd be sitting around the radio, knowing what was going to be said and knowing it was going to cause more grief. We had a list of names of the men who were out there, and next to each name was a number. Out in the field, they had the same list of names with the same numbers. Because of radio security, no names were allowed to be used over the air, so the numbers were used. Number 64 is dead. Then someone would pick up the list of names. We already knew someone was dead. We already knew whoever belonged to number 64 would be scratched off the list. Now we had to find the name that belonged to that number. I'd stop breathing and my mind would stop working for an instant until someone said the name. Then I'd have an explosion of memories, and I'd try not to remember because there was no use in remembering now. Another man lost, and somehow every day I was supposed to keep working and not think, to avoid knowing another man is dead, because if I thought about it and allowed myself to feel what was going on deep inside of me, I would have cried, and I would have crawled into bed and closed my eyes and prayed that this nightmare would end. I'd wake up every morning and I'd lie in bed and concentrate on getting up enough energy to sit up. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, hunched over, feeling very hollow and empty. A tired, miserable shell that had to make it through another day. Somehow I made it through yesterday, and that was wonderful because I was a day closer to leaving. And if I did the same thing today, I'd have another day gone. That was one of the only things to look forward to. And I'd work and drink beer during the day and at night, and drank beer and smoked pot, and we'd laugh, and sometimes we'd sing or we'd talk about back home, and we'd listen to music. And there were times when we were able, for a while, to forget what was going on, to forget the numbers on the radio, to forget the hospitals, to forget about the guns and the blood, to go to bed at night and be able to sleep without lying awake thinking in the dark. I was afraid to think in the dark. I was afraid of the kind of thoughts that would go through my mind. It was easier during the day because I was doing something. I could focus my mind on it. Late at night when it was quiet and the lights were out and nothing to do, I tried not to think. The men in the field had the worst of it. They didn't hear numbers over the radio. They saw the man blown to bits or shot, or his fresh stump pouring blood into a rice paddy. Those young green kids were turned into hardened professional killers. After each death and casualty, your heart gets a little harder and your mind a little narrower, until, after a few months, killing and survival are the only things to think about. Somehow you begin to accept death as a part of every day. There had been many names added to the first man who was shot, and after each name was added, more was taken away from inside. Those who were out in the field had more to forget than anyone, more not to think about. What's it like out in the field? It's hell out in the field. Hell, that's what it's like. That's what it is. Let me try to describe it to you. Let me try to tell you, you who haven't been there, who still don't realize there's a war going on in Vietnam. I want you to consider the next time you go to the bathroom, every step you take. Every time you put your foot down and it meets the floor. I want you to think the next step you take will be the last step you will ever take. Now try again. Try to think about that. Put your mind into it. I know you've gone there before and nothing happened. I know it's hard to imagine. I know it doesn't seem likely. Try again. Try to think that the next time you take a step, the biggest thing left to identify you is going to be your dog tags, or maybe you'll be as lucky as Sanchez. He had his life, but he still left 2 arms and 2 legs in Vietnam. Or maybe you'll just step on a small mine like Williams and only lose 2 feet. 70 or 80% of our dead and wounded never saw anything. They were just walking. I want you to try very hard and take that bathroom and place it a year away. A year, 12 months, 365 days, and multiply that by a split second, the amount of time it takes to die, and add to that the fear and the terror of each day, and then live each day one at a time, slowly. And have your friend walk in front of you to the bathroom and watch the explosion, or maybe you'd like to be first, the first man in line. It's a lot easier putting your foot where the last man stepped. Maybe you like to be the first man and try to figure out where the next mine is. Some are right in the middle of the small paths. Some are on the sides of the paths. So when a sniper opens up and everyone hits the ground, someone finds a mine. Some are under trees. Take a break after walking in the heat of the sun for hours and sit down and relax under the shade of a tree and die. Some are up in trees, tripped by a wire, and they spray enough metal into the air to put a man in the morgue and a few in the hospital. Have you started to fear yet? Have you considered yet that your next breath might be your last? Have you seen the suffering yet? Have you seen the choppers come in and carry out the bodies yet? Have you seen the waste yet? Do you know what it's like to be mortared? The whistle of a bomb coming out of the sky meant for you. Something that lands with a force that moves the earth. Something to leave not enough of you to send home. Something you can't stop, that comes down, that you can't see and you can't shoot at and you can't run from. It starts with a faint whistle that starts to grow and gets louder and louder until your head swims with fear and noise. And you crouch down in your hole in the ground and you get down as far as you can and you wait for it to be over, and every second is a lifetime. And somewhere in the back of your mind you know there's a chance of a round coming into your hole because you remember what happened to Davis and you don't want your name added to that list. That part of the burden your mind carries every day. Add to that what your body has to get. Put that in your mind. The kind of heat that makes things look like they're wavering in the distance. And then add the weight to the heat. Put a pack on your back with a poncho and a blanket and food for 2 or 3 meals, and cleaning equipment for your weapon, a mosquito repellent, a pair of extra socks, a few important letters and some candy bars and toilet paper, and a small shovel and envelopes and writing paper and ammunition for your rifle, and ammunition for the machine gun, or a claymore mine which is used for defenses at night, or a mine detector. I used to send out the mine detector and the men would break it and send it back in because they didn't want to carry the extra weight. After you get through saddling up, you have anything from 40 to 60 pounds you've got to carry and walk with, run, sweat, and fight with. You're out in the field in the heat, worrying about every step you take, watching men die and be maimed while you're looking for the enemy. After a while, men who had to live like that begin to change. They had to change. I thank God I never had to stay out there. When they started to tell me stories of killing without flinching, without shrinking, I could see the change. when some of them started to call the Vietnamese dinks, not because everyone was calling them dinks, but because they meant it, I saw the change. When I heard about a man who cut off the ear of his victim, I knew they had changed. When I started listening without flinching, I knew I had changed. And when they came out of My Lai, I heard the stories they came back with. I didn't know whether they were true because I wasn't there. If they were true, it meant my company had murdered people. It meant I had helped by making sure the weapons worked. It meant my friends were in serious trouble because they had been taught their job too well. It meant speaking out against something I was told was right, but deep within I knew wasn't right. It meant because of lies I had been told I was sitting in the middle of a useless war. It meant if I died in Vietnam, my life would have been used and wasted. And it meant that each day as I did my assigned job, I was contributing my small share to keep the war going. It meant the men who already died and the men who were going to die were throwing away their lives. It meant I was helping to continue something I felt was wrong. It meant if I decided not to do my job anymore, I would be sent to jail and court-martialed. It meant a lot of people would think I was a traitor to my country because I didn't believe in the war anymore. It meant some of the people in the company and outside the army would hate me because they wouldn't understand why I had changed my mind. It meant I would get a dishonorable discharge. It meant I would find it hard to get a job. It meant losing the privileges of the GI Bill for schools and hospital care. It meant hardships on my parents. It meant a lot of bad things I didn't want to think about, based on stories I wasn't sure were true. So I decided to forget about it. Nothing else brought up or said about it, and it wasn't until I was out of the army for about 9 months that it was brought out into the open. I still don't know whether the stories about my company are true, because the soldier who did speak out was part of another company, and that was also at My Lai. I do know that through his courage, I have gotten the strength not to forget. The people we're fighting for are dying under our bombs and under our rifles and machine guns. That's why the war is a lie, and the reasons for the war are lies. Are there any mothers in the United States of America who can possibly feel, who can understand the agony of a Vietnamese mother? Try. Please try. Are there any fathers in the United States of America who have loved their children, who have done everything within their power to keep them safe and healthy and well fed? Are there any parents in America who have loved their children with a deep, full, beautiful love, who have sweated and strained and worked and thought of everything they could do to try to make their children happy? Please believe me when I tell you a Vietnamese family loves and cares and tries as hard as any other family to create love, to have food, and to have a home. A child cannot grow up to be a free man when he is shot in his crib. Do you know how many children have already died in Vietnam? Do you know how many napalm bombs have fallen and made children and adults look like diseased, inhuman plants? A Vietnamese child who was loved by a Vietnamese mother and a Vietnamese father, and a bomb fell and changed the Vietnamese child who had 2 arms and 2 legs into a vegetable. That bomb was dropped to make that child free. Do you have any idea of how you would feel if a bomb came down and killed your child, your husband, your wife? Think about it. You just lost your child today, and the people who killed your child and said they were fighting for your freedom, and you wonder what's left of your freedom if you can't protect your child from the people who say they were saving her. And what are you going to do then? You're going to cry. You're going to feel grief as deep as any grief you've ever had, because you're just one human being who has lost a child. Your child is dead. Your child is dead. And you can't drag the bombers down from the sky, and you can't go to the runway and you can't stop them, and you can't write your congressman or your senator, and you can't plead with the American people. You can't get down on your hands and knees and beg them to stop killing your family, because they're on the other side of the world and they can't hear you. And the American people cannot hear you sobbing through the night, and you're helpless and you're alone, and you're trapped, and you and your family are going to be killed either by the North Vietnamese or the Americans. They are going to annihilate you and your village, and the food you used to grow and to eat is gone. More bombs with more chemicals to destroy the ability of the earth to produce food for you to eat. Chemicals that make the earth useless for 20 years. Drop from the sky into your field to protect your freedom and starve you to death. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when an American infantry company comes into your village and huddles the villagers together and searches the village for weapons and men, and they tear apart your houses and break your dishes and cut up your woven basket that took so many hours to make, and spill pounds of rice on your floors, and sometimes use some of the women and kill your oxen, animals that have been in the family for years, who help plow the soil, whom you need to produce your food, and they are shot for target practice. What are you going to do? What are you going to do with your land gone and your people dying? There's nothing you can do. Nothing that can be done until enough people know the misery and the grief and the pain you're going through and are willing to stop it. Please help stop the war. Please. Please stop men from going to villages and leaving no one. No bombs, just bullets to destroy a village and the people in it. No bombs dropped from thousands of feet and leaving death. These were men facing and looking at and killing human beings. Men who had quietly lain on the deck of a ship wondering about Vietnam. Men who had never killed and had learned to kill to stay alive. They had gone into My Lai Peninsula 2 or 3 times. And each time, men who had quietly lain on the deck of a ship wondering about Vietnam. Men who had never killed and had learned to kill to stay alive. They had gone to My Lai Peninsula 2 or 3 times. Men who had quietly lain on the deck of a ship, wondering about Vietnam. Men who had never killed and had learned to kill to stay alive. They had gone to My Lai Peninsula 2 or 3 times, and each time they went, some men died and some men lost their limbs. And every man they lost when they went there was lost to a mine. And they saw their friends butchered by explosions and metal, and they looked around for someone to pay the price for that friend, and there was no one there. There was nothing to shoot at, no one to hate, nothing to do but pick up the bodies. And they began to fear My Lai. It was one of the few places they had to keep going back to, and every time they went, someone didn't come back. It was an enemy stronghold. Every time they left, the enemy came in, took over the helpless villagers, planted more mines for the next time. And the next time came, and more of our men lost their lives. The men didn't want to go into that peninsula, but there was nothing they could do. The order was sent down, and they walked in, and they knew someone was going to die, and they knew that this might be their last day to watch, and they walked in, and men did die that day and were wounded again. And they got more rifles to clean, and the clerk scratched one more name off the list, and the supply sergeant sent more duffel bags back home to the families. And they were told to go into My Lai again. They took a company of men from 4 or 5 battalions, and they formed a battalion, and that battalion of men was told to go into My Lai and put an end to the enemy stronghold, to put an end to any civilian sympathizers who had allowed the enemy to plant mines. Civilian sympathizers are people who don't have the strength and the power to fight off the Vietnamese or the Americans, who can't stop any army with the love of their family, who don't have the power to pick up a rifle and stop an army. Civilian sympathizers are human beings trapped between 2 huge powers, 2 huge governments, and who are being murdered. May God forgive the men who went into My Lai. May God forgive me because I helped them. And there is someone else responsible for My Lai, the American people. The American people have decided we should be in Vietnam. We are as responsible as the men who give the orders and pull the triggers because we decided as a people to send them to Vietnam. We decided to put them on the battlefield, a battlefield that can change the mind of an American man, that can change that mind so much that he forgets about love and about God and about people, that changes that mind so much that he can kill an infant and think he's fighting for American ideals. And the war has changed the minds of the American people so much they also have forgotten about love and God and about human beings. And we hear about our men shooting innocent Vietnamese babies and still allow the war to go on. To send more of our young men over to be killed and to become killers and still think the war is just. One night every American has the responsibility of turning out the light, lying in the dark and wondering what has become of us, what has happened to our country and our people. This country is founded on its trust in God. Why did we start believing in killing? When did we start believing in killing children and stop believing in God? We have lost sight of our hearts and our love for people. It's easy to forget Vietnam when we're half a world away. It's easy to forget My Lai. Please don't forget. We can't forget about men, women, and children. We can't forget about people. May God forgive us for the people who have already been forgotten. This is the last page. That's a child who's been, or has the effect of the napalm bombing. And then under it, it says, would you try to stop a war that did this to your child? And then on the back I have spent several days trying to decide what price I should put on this booklet. I have discussed it with several people I know. I finally decided it was more important for people to read this than to be stopped by a price on the cover. Unfortunately, the company which printed this booklet did not give them away. They charged about 6 cents a copy. If we don't get any money back, we won't be able to print any more booklets. If this booklet has helped you understand the war better, and if you think that would be a good idea for other people to read it, then please do this. Take an envelope and a stamp, take a pen and a dime, and use one of the addresses above. It's a way of finding out how much you're willing to do. I know from my experience at mail call that a lot of people I found it very difficult to get a letter in the mail. There's always a need for money, whether it's for the booklets or other parts of the anti-war program. Please take the time and the effort. The names of the individuals mentioned in the story are fictitious. Those stories are true, but I just changed the names. So that's all that I need to say at this point. And I know obviously it's been a long time since this war has been over. There may be many people who read this who were never alive at that time, who were not alive at that time. But I've just heard other Vietnam veterans on YouTube share their experience of being there, and I would think to a certain extent the wars that are going on now can end up falling into the same category. And besides that, just as far as understanding something of history, either that you went through because you are old enough to have gone through it, or young enough that all you know is some of the stories that you've heard that have come out of that time, this might add a little more to your understanding of that time, of situations being in the army, and how war can change can change someone. So thanks for listening.